So last year, after a quarter century of meditating on Shusaku Endo's novel entitled Silence, Martin Scorsese finally saw the realization of his long gestating passion project, bringing the novel to the big screen. Careful observers of Scorsese's work can detect his long, complicated struggle with matters of faith, with how belief and mystery complicate the way we live in the world as people who are flesh and blood and passion and desire. No wonder. Raised an Italian-American Catholic in New York City, the young Scorsese seriously considered becoming a priest before he decided to go to film school. No one would call his filmography a litany of Christian films. From Goodfellas to The Departed, Taxi Driver to The Wolf of Wall Street, his movies are filled with characters resorting to violence, addiction, and empty drives for sex, money, and fame. Read their plot summaries in order, and it sounds an awful lot like the lineup of Old Testament characters. In 1988, Scorsese made a movie called The Last Temptation of Christ, a film based on a 1955 novel that imagined Christ as uncertain about his calling and portrayed him as being tempted by fear, doubt, depression, reluctance, and lust. Scorsese had hoped the film would lead to open dialogue about spiritual issues in the public square, and Christ specifically. He told the LA Times last year that Jesus, quote, has to be fully divine and fully human. And the teaching at Catholic schools emphasized the divine to the point where if Jesus showed up in your classroom, you'd expect him to glow in the dark. So I wanted to get into that duality, but it was seen as a provocation, but the provocation was to think. Instead of being a provocation, the film prompted a vehement outcry from many Christian quarters. It was picketed and even firebombed in theaters where the film was being shown. In one theater in Paris, an attack from religious activists left one viewer burned and several others injured, and it took 3 years for the theater to reopen. Scorsese was completely drained by this experience, by the criticisms and the death threats that he received, many from people who hadn't even seen the film. At dinner one night near the film's release, the Episcopal Bishop, Archbishop Paul Moore Jr., told the director that he wanted to send him a copy of Endo's 1966 novel, which tells the story of 17th century Portuguese priests on a mission to find their mentor, a missionary in Japan who's rumored to have apostatized. There they find their faith immensely complicated by encountering Japanese Christians oppressed by a regime that's attempting to stamp out Christianity along with any other European influence. The Christians, and eventually the priests, are tortured and even killed unless they agree to stamp on the fume an image of Christ. Endo's novel is a work of historical fiction, but it's based in fact. Makoto Fujimura, who's written extensively about the novel and the film, tells me that he's seen fume in Japan worn smooth by stamping feet. Scorsese wasn't able to make Silence right away, but he optioned the book way back in 1989, just after he read it. And at last year, it was released. I watched it in a full audience of professional critics in New York City about a month before the release, on the same evening it was screening for the Directors Guild. You cannot easily impress film critics, even if you're Martin Scorsese. But an unusual thing happened during our screening, something I've honestly never seen in my decade of watching movies with critics in New York. The film is really difficult to watch, though it's lushly shot and acted. There are scenes of torture. But in a theater full of critics, the majority of whom are skeptics, agnostics, and atheists, something palpable settled over us like a holy hush. We were experiencing something more than a movie together. When it was all over, the room sat in a kind of stunned suspension, unwilling to get up and leave, even though it was 10 p.m. on a Friday night. The first time I heard the room's hush was in a scene where Father Rodriguez, played by Andrew Garfield, and Father Garupe, played by Adam Driver, joyfully and quietly commune with a group of hidden Japanese Christians. When they take leave of the group, one man asks them a question that is on everyone's mind. We have a clip.
But Padre, if we are forced to trample on the Lord, on the Fumi,
You must pray for courage, Mokichi.
but if we do not do what they want, there can be danger for everyone in the village. They can be put in prison, taken away forever. What should we do?
Tremble. Tremble. It's all right to tremble.
What are you saying? You can't. Mokichi? You can't.
What should we do if they make us trample? They don't have an answer. The two men, equally devoted followers of Christ, have not come to the same conclusion about what is acceptable in the eyes of God and what is not. The reason for this is marvelously complex and quite simple. The Bible doesn't say anything about fume, and the pre-European culture has no context to answer. To defame the image of Christ by smearing mud from one's feet on it could be significant, a soul-altering act in a kind of culture driven by images because the images are so scarce. But what if one's life and the continuation of the church is at stake? Is it possible to trample and remain faithful to God? God on this point is curiously silent, and his silence begins to throw the priest's settled beliefs into turmoil. It's not hard to see in this simple question a parallel to Scorsese's struggle with the last temptation of Christ, and with those who threatened him with death for doing what they considered violent desecration to the image of Christ, this time in an image-soaked culture. This experience and the response left lasting impressions on the director. And the thing is, God is silent. Scorsese didn't die after the last temptation of Christ, and Christianity didn't either, though violence did occur, both literal and psychological, in Christ's name. But then again, what is right there? And can a person transgress willingly and still be saved? What I see in silence is Scorsese's Lament, which, of course, being Scorsese, takes the form of a film. He laments God's silence on so many matters that are culturally bound. He laments his long struggle to find Christ in the midst of the madness. In his recently released book, Movies Are Prayers, the critic Josh Larson writes about films that function as laments, and here's what he says. Lament, whatever form it takes, is at heart a prayer, an expression of despair in the hope of being heard. Christian lament is not simply complaint. Yes, it stares clear-eyed at the awfulness and even wonders if God has gone. But at its fullness, biblical lament expresses sorrow over loving a world that was once good, alongside a belief that it can be made good again. In the film, Rodriguez is eventually imprisoned by a man called the Inquisitor and told that if he will just repudiate Christ by stamping on the fume, the Japanese Christians who are being tortured will be saved. Rodriguez tries to argue, steadfast in his belief that while it would be okay for the Japanese Christians to trample in order to avoid death, he, Rodriguez, a man of the cloth and more than just some ordinary Japanese Christian, could never and would never do such a thing. But the Inquisitor chips away at Rodriguez and eventually gets him what he had come for originally, an encounter with his mentor, Father Ferreira, who indeed did apostatize. Ferreira exhorts Rodriguez as he languishes in his cell in this clip.
Don't speak to me. You have no right to speak to me.
Oh, I do. Because you are just like me. You see Jesus in Gethsemane and believe your trial is the same as his. Those 5 in the pit are suffering too, just like Jesus, but they don't have your pride. They would never compare themselves to Jesus. Do you have the right to make them suffer? I heard the cries of suffering in this same cell, and I acted.
You excuse yourself! You excuse yourself! That is the spirit of darkness!
And what would you do for them? Pray? And get what in return? Only more suffering. A suffering only you can end. Not God.
Go away from me!
I pray too, Rodriguez. It doesn't help. Go on. Pray. But pray with your eyes open.
I pray too, it doesn't help, Ferreira says. This is what Rodriguez is finding. The God he once felt so close to seems curiously far away. Has he left him? Has he forsaken him? The film slowly exposes Rodriguez's presumptions about his own holiness, and even his sense of superiority to the Japanese, which comes from being secure in his salvation. But God's silence completely unnerves him. Where is God? The path, the sorrow, the psychological toil, and the broken world become excruciating for Rodriguez, whose once sure footing is turned upside down as he struggles to make sense of why God doesn't save him. Yet he despairs with the hope of being heard. And in one of the film's most crucial scenes, God talks back.
There is something more important than the judgment of the church. You are now going to fulfill the most painful act of love that has ever been performed.
It's only a formality. Just a formality.
Come ahead now. It's all right. Step on me. I understand your pain. I was born into this world to share men's pain. I carried this cross for your pain. Your life is with me now. Step.
I can't express to you the emotion in the room full of critics, most of whom have little use for organized religion, when this scene played out. Months later, I still was hearing people talking about it. I don't believe in God, one person said to another in a row behind me at Sundance a month later, but that scene really did something to me that I don't really understand. Another friend told me, silence is the only thing that makes me want to believe in God. I'm confident that silence provided Scorsese with a way to both ponder Christ in his suffering and also pour out his soul to create a work of art that can lament on our behalf. He made a long gestating passion project into a kind of conduit for everyone who finds themselves torn up and conflicted by the friction between the church, the culture, their own self-perception, and finds themselves crying out with the psalmist, "How long, O Lord?" Shamefully, but to nobody's surprise, the church didn't respond to this film. Silence was praised by many critics, but went virtually unnoticed by most Christian viewers. Some of them have apologetically told me that they just couldn't watch something that heavy. I'm afraid for us, especially those of us who sit in a position of privilege, we seem more concerned with being encouraged or entertained by what we watch than engaging with art in the fullness of human questioning. I confess, I find many reasons to be disappointed by my fellow believers lately and to be disappointed by myself. But chief among them is the conviction that we're no longer able or willing to lament anything anymore because we don't like what it might say about us. All I know is what I experienced when I saw this film and how I saw the film act on others who saw it too. Here's how it changed me. The genius of Endo's story and Scorsese's adaptation is that it won't characterize anyone as a saint, nor will it either fully condone or reject colonialist impulses, or the religious oppression, the apostasy, or the faltering faith of its characters. There's space within the story for every broken attempt to fix the world. Endo's attempt still lies in Christ, but his perception of Christ is radically different from what most people are familiar with. And even those who don't identify with Christianity will find this film unnerving and haunting. Silence is the kind of film that cuts at everyone's self-perceptions, including my own. I haven't been able to shake it because I need to remember now, frankly, more than ever, that I am not responsible to save the world, let alone myself. How the world changes is a giant cosmic mystery. To grow too far from that and be hardened to my own belief and disbelief is a danger. I grow complacent and deaf, too willing to push others away. In silence, nobody is Christ except Christ himself. Everyone else is a Peter or a Judas, a faltering rejecter for whom there may be home anyway. What Scorsese has accomplished in adapting Endo's novel is a close reminder that the path to redemption lies through suffering, and that it may not be I who must save the world so much as I'm the one who needs saving.